In the autumn of 1887, in the Kansas Territory where the short grass prairie ran flat and pale to the horizon, and the sky above it was the color of a bruise at dusk, a woman named Vera Cass stood at the edge of a farmstead that no longer belonged to anyone. She was 27 years old. She carried a leather satchel her father had given her the spring he died, and inside that satchel were three things: a magnifying lens ground from German glass, a small tin of ink with a cork stopper, a folding knife her father had used to pare the edges of vellum when the grain ran wrong. She had $41 to her name. She had no husband, no family remaining in this part of the country, and no employment that winter promised to hold. What she had, in the place of those absent things, was the thing her father had spent the last 12 years of his life teaching her to do. She could read a deed, not in the way a land office clerk could read one, running a finger down printed columns for the transfer date and the assessed value. Vera Cass could read a deed the way a surgeon reads tissue, the way a tracker reads compressed earth. She had been taught to see the watermark pressed into the paper before any ink touched it, to distinguish the hand of a recorder from the hand of a grantor, to find the marginal notations a busy county office stamped over in red and called settled. Her father, Thomas Cass, had worked for 22 years as a deed examiner for the land office in Wichita, and in the last years before the consumption took him, he had taught his daughter everything the work required. He taught her because she was the one who sat beside him in the evenings when the light was good. He taught her because she asked. Thomas Cass had believed that the record was the last honest institution. Not the courts, which were run by men with preferences, and not the banks, which were run by men with interests, but the record itself, the raw ledger of instruments filed in order of their recording, which did not know who the parties were, and did not care who wanted a particular outcome. He had also believed that almost no one read it completely, which was why defects accumulated the way they did, compounding through chains of title like small errors in arithmetic that go uncorrected for 20 years and then become a sum no one can account for. He had made Vera read complete chains from the time she was 14. He had made her do it without knowing the outcome, so she could not let the outcome lead her to what she found. He died in February of 1884. She had continued in the Wichita land office for 3 years after that. The farmstead before her now had a sign nailed to the fence post at the road. The sign was a pine board painted white, and on it in black letters applied with a brush that had been loaded too heavily and allowed to drip, was the word foreclosed. Below that, a date. Below that, the name of a bank. The sign had been there for 11 months. If you have ever driven past a foreclosure notice on a country road, you may have felt the flat finality of it, the way an official announcement seems to close a thing as permanently as a lid on a box. Stay close to this story, because what she saw when she read that sign was not finality. What she saw was a question no one had yet thought to ask. The farmstead itself had belonged to a man named Roland Pruitt. He had worked the land for 9 years, and in the 7th year had borrowed against it from the Merchants and Settlers Bank of Caldwell to buy seed after a hail year took the crop. The loan had carried interest at a rate the bank's agent had described in the office as customary, and the papers Roland signed had been prepared by the bank's own attorney. Roland Pruitt had made 4 payments, and then a second drought year had followed the first, and in the spring of 1886 the bank had sent a notice, and then a man, and then the sign. Roland Pruitt was gone now to his wife's people in Missouri. The farmstead stood empty, the house's 2 windows watching the road like closed eyes that had been persuaded, with some effort, to stay shut. Vera had learned of the property from an old man named Aldrich, who kept a dry goods counter in the town of Colson, 3 miles east along the wagon road. Aldrich had known Thomas Cass in the years when her father had passed through the county on survey work, and when Vera arrived in Colson in September looking for a room and work that used her hands, Aldrich had given her a corner of his storeroom and had told her about the Pruitt place the way a man mentions a bird that flew into a window. Sad thing. Useless now. The bank hadn't bothered to sell it. Too far out. Too much trouble. Vera had listened and said nothing for a moment. Then she had said, "Who holds the original grant on that section?" Aldrich had looked at her with the expression men sometimes wore when a woman asked a question they had not considered. He said he supposed it went back to the territorial patent. Might be a homestead claim under it. Might be earlier. He did not know. "I would like to see the sign," Vera said. He had ridden out with her the next morning in his wagon, and she had stood at the fence post for a long time, reading the painted pine board in the early light. The sign itself told her three things: the bank's name, the date of the foreclosure, and a survey notation that had been abbreviated in the bottom right corner of the board, pressed there with a rubber stamp, barely legible under the paint, but present. S2NW 4 SEC 14T 31 SR 3W. Her father had taught her to read a deed the way other men's fathers taught them to read a compass. Section 14, Township 31 South, Range 3 West. She had it memorized before Aldrich had finished tying the horse. Before she came to Colson, Vera had spent 3 years in the Wichita Land Office itself, working as what the recorder's chief clerk called an assistant copyist, which was the name given to the work because the office had no other name for what a woman might legitimately do there. What she actually did was prepare abstract chains for the senior examiners, organizing the page sequence, flagging the instruments that needed closer reading, and drafting the examination memoranda that the examiners then reviewed and signed as their own. She had done this without complaint because the work was real work, and the access it gave her to the original documents was worth more than the title on the door. She read every abstract that passed through her hands. She read them the way her father had taught her, which was completely. She had also, in those 3 years, found 4 defects that the examiners had missed. She had brought each one to the attention of the senior examiner, a man named Whitfield, who had the quality of acknowledging a correction with a single nod and no further comment, and who had raised her weekly wage by 50 cents after the second one, which was the nearest thing to praise she received from that office in 3 years. She had left Wichita in July of 1887, when her father's younger brother, who had been contributing to the room she rented after Thomas Cass died, withdrew his support without explanation. The uncle was a practical man, and he had practical reservations about the return on investing in a woman's employment in a field that had no formal opening for her. These were the same reservations, broadly, that the land office had held, and they were not worth arguing with. Vera had paid her remaining month's rent, packed her satchel, and taken the stage south. What she did not say to Aldrich then or later was what that notation suggested to a person who had spent years reading original patents in the Wichita Land Office. The southwestern quarter of Section 14 in that township and range had been part of a block of land granted by a congressional patent in 1868 to a railroad company that had subsequently reorganized twice, changed its name once, and gone into receivership in 1881. The grant itself had contained a reverter clause, a provision her father had explained to her as a kind of legal trapdoor, language stating that if the railroad failed to complete a spur line through the section within 15 years of the patent date, the land reverted to the prior claimants of record. Her father had shown her reverter clauses in railroad patents, the way a naturalist shows a student a species that is common in the field but rarely noticed because it requires a close look. Congress had inserted them into land grants throughout the 1860s and 1870s as a condition on the railroad corporation's windfall, and the railroads had, in many cases, reorganized or folded before the conditions were met, and the land offices had, in many cases, not gone back to check. The land that should have reverted had not reverted because no one had looked. The paper was there. The clause was there. The railroad was gone. The spur line had never been built. She had known this in the abstract for years. She had not, before this morning, stood at the fence post of a specific parcel and felt the abstraction become particular. The spur line had not been built. No one, as far as Vera could determine from what was visible on the bank's painted sign, had gone back to read the original patent. The county recorder's office in Caldwell was a single room off the back of the courthouse, with a pine floor that had warped in the center, and 3 walls of wooden filing cabinets, each drawer labeled in faded ink. Vera arrived on a Tuesday morning when the recorder, a stout man named Briggs, was absent at a hearing, and his assistant, a boy of perhaps 17 named Cal, had been left to manage the office alone. Cal had the look of a young man who had been told once that his job was important and had taken it seriously ever since. Vera set her satchel on the counter and asked for the patent abstracts for Section 14, Township 31, Range 3 West. Cal told her that the abstracts were for official reference only. Vera told him that she was conducting a title examination on behalf of a party considering a purchase, which was true in the only sense that mattered. She set $1 on the counter. Cal looked at the dollar. He went to the 3rd cabinet from the left, opened the bottom drawer, and produced a bound ledger of original patent abstracts. She worked at the counter for 4 hours. Cal offered at the end of the first hour to bring her a chair. She accepted. He brought a straight-back chair from behind the filing cabinets and set it at the counter without comment, and she nodded to him and returned to the ledger. He did not ask what she was looking for. She appreciated this. Anyone who watched her work tended to want to know what she expected to find, and answering that question always required her to explain that she did not know what she expected to find, which was precisely why she was reading the whole document and not the part they thought she should read. The German lens her father had left her was necessary within the first 20 minutes. The original railroad patent had been recorded on onion skin paper, the kind that dried brittle after 15 years in a wooden cabinet, and the reverter clause was written in a hand that compressed its letters the way a man trying to shorten a long walk will shorten his stride. The clause was there. It was clear. The condition was an operating spur line through the section by the spring of 1883, 14 years after the patent was recorded, and there was no recorded certificate of completion. She set the lens aside and turned back 3 pages in the ledger, then 4, then 6. A county abstract ledger of this period was organized in order of recordation, not in order of geographic section, and the entries were dense and unevenly spaced because different recorders had kept different habits with margins. Her father had explained this to her when she was 11 years old, sitting beside his desk, and he had said that the disorder was not an accident. A ledger organized by section would have made it obvious when 2 instruments claimed the same ground. A ledger organized by date required someone to do the reading. She did the reading. There was something else. Beneath the railroad patent in the ledger, filed 1 page earlier and therefore earlier in time, was a homestead entry dated 1866. The name on the homestead entry was Nora Finch. The entry was for a preemption claim on the northeastern quarter of Section 14. Under territorial preemption law, a prior valid homestead claim, if it had not been formally canceled by the land office before the railroad grant was issued, held superior right. Vera found no cancellation. She went through the ledger forward from the Finch entry, and then backward to the entries immediately preceding it. looking for a notation of abandonment, a notice of forfeiture, a letter from the land office marked into the margins. She found nothing of the kind. The Finch entry stood in the ledger uncancelled, the ink brown with age but legible. The claim for a quarter section of good flat ground, recorded in a neat, clear hand, the kind of hand a woman uses when she knows the document will need to speak for itself long after she is gone. She set the lens down on the counter. She looked at the page for a long time without touching it. Outside, a wagon passed on the street and the harness bells rang once and then faded. The homestead entry for Nora Finch in 1866 had never been canceled and never been converted to a patent. The railroad grant had been issued 2 years later and had absorbed the parcel without any notation of the prior claim. The bank's foreclosure in 1886 had been conducted against Roland Pruitt's interest, which Roland had derived from a deed chain that traced back through 3 conveyances to the railroad's receivership sale in 1881. None of those conveyances had been good. They had all transferred something the railroad did not own cleanly. The bank had foreclosed on a title that was, at its root, defective. She spent the remaining 2 hours copying. Her father had taught her to copy an abstract entry verbatim, every word, never to paraphrase an instrument when the instrument itself was the evidence. She used the ink from her tin and the pen she carried folded in her satchel, and she wrote out the Finch entry, the railroad patent and the reverter clause in full, noting on each copy the ledger volume and page from which it came, the date of her examination, and her name as examiner. She did this in the same format she had used in the Wichita land office, because it was the format a court would recognize, and because she already understood, in the quiet, certain way that comes from having read a ledger correctly, that this was where the document was going. What Vera did next was not confrontation. It was not accusation. She closed the ledger carefully, spine first, and replaced it in the bottom drawer of the 3rd cabinet. She thanked Cal. She walked out of the courthouse into the October morning with her satchel over her shoulder and the survey notation written in pencil on a folded slip of paper in her coat pocket. She walked to the telegraph office and sent a message to a woman named Elsa Finch in Emporia, whose address she had found in the 1880 census index at the back of the land office's reference shelf. She wrote that Nora had held a preemption claim and that she believed it had never been lawfully canceled. If Elsa could come to Caldwell, Vera could show her what she had found. The response came 2 days later. It was 4 words: "I will be Thursday." Elsa Finch arrived on the Thursday morning stage from Emporia. She was 53 years old, a small woman with iron gray hair and the particular kind of stillness that comes from having carried a grief for so long it has become load-bearing. She had her mother's homestead certificate in her coat pocket, folded inside a piece of oilcloth. Her mother had kept it in a tin box under the floorboards until she died in 1879, and Elsa had kept it in her own possession since, not knowing what to do with it and unable to bring herself to throw it away. Nora Finch had come to Kansas in 1865 with her husband and 3 children, and she had filed the preemption claim in the spring of 1866 when her husband's health failed, and it was clear he could not do the homesteading work himself. Nora had done the filing because she knew, in the practical way that frontier women came to know such things, that her name on the paper was worth more than her husband's name in the circumstances. He died in the winter of 1867. The claim remained in her name. She had farmed the northeastern quarter with her 3 children until 1872, when the cost of the conversion fee was more than she had, and she had written to the land office in Topeka, asking for an extension of time to make the payment. The land office had not replied. She had written again the following year. There was no reply on file. Elsa had been 12 in 1872. She remembered the letters going out and not coming back. She had not known, then or in the years since, what the silence meant. She had assumed it meant her mother's claim was gone, and her mother had eventually told her children the same thing, and they had all proceeded on that understanding. The tin box under the floorboards held the certificate because Nora Finch could not quite persuade herself to throw it away. Neither could Elsa. They met in Aldrich's storeroom, and Vera spread the land office abstracts she had copied out in her own hand across the counter. She walked Elsa through it slowly, the way her father had walked her through documents when she was young, naming each element as she touched it, giving each one its plain English term before she used the legal one. Elsa said very little. She looked at the copied pages with the attention of a woman who has been told all her life that what her mother was given was nothing, and is now being shown that it was something. Aldrich stood at the far end of the counter and pretended to read a ledger of his own. After a quarter hour, he went into the storeroom back and did not reappear, which was his way of giving them the space. Elsa picked up the copy of the Finch homestead entry and held it as if weighing it. Then she set it down and produced the oilcloth packet from her coat pocket and unfolded it on the counter. Inside was a document that had once been crisp and was now soft with years of handling along the fold lines, but legible. The homestead certificate Nora Finch had received from the land office in 1866. The signature at the bottom was the Kansas Territorial Commissioner's, and the wax seal that had pressed beside it had dried and cracked, but the impression remained. Vera looked at it beside her copy. The parcel description matched exactly, word for word. "This means the farm," Elsa said finally. "The northeastern quarter of it, yes," Vera said. "Not all 160 acres. The railroad's grant on the southern portion was clean. Your mother's claim covers the northern half of what Pruitt farmed." Elsa Finch put her hand flat on the copied pages. She did not speak for a moment. Then she said, "My mother walked that land every spring. She said it was hers and no one ever listened. The record listened," Vera said. "It was waiting. The legal process that followed was not swift and it was not simple, and it involved a land attorney in Wichita named Harmon, whom Vera had known through her father's correspondence and who charged a contingency arrangement that Vera negotiated down to a reasonable share. She wrote to Harmon the same week she sent the telegraph to Elsa, enclosing a summary of the chain defect in 2 pages, and Harmon wrote back in 10 days. His letter was businesslike and brief. He said the claim was sound and the case was makeable, and he would need a certified copy of the abstract chain and a written examination with her signature on it before he could file. She had the certified copies already. She had made them at the counter in Caldwell with Cal watching, and Cal had initialed each page as a witness to the copying, which she had asked him to do and which he had done without fully understanding why. Which was why she had asked him to do it when Briggs was absent. Harmon filed a quiet title action in the federal land court in November of 1887, and the Merchants and Settlers Bank of Caldwell engaged their own attorney, a man named Pierce, who spent 3 weeks arguing that the preemption claim had been constructively abandoned. Pierce was a confident man. He had a set of arguments that he used in this kind of proceeding, and that had served him well, and the central one was that a claimant who had not converted a homestead entry to a patent within the statutory period had signaled abandonment of the claim. He said this in correspondence and said it again in a motion, and he said it with the particular fluency of a man who has said the same thing many times and has not recently been wrong. Harmon asked Vera to prepare a written examination of the abstract chain. She sat in her corner of Aldrich's storeroom for 9 days and wrote it out in her best hand, 8 pages, with citations to the statutory sections her father had made her memorize as a child, and with the magnifying lens notation on the reverter clause attached as a signed exhibit. She addressed Pierce's constructive abandonment argument on page 4. Under the territorial law in effect in 1866, conversion of a preemption entry to a patent required a cash payment to the land office, and that payment required the claimant to have the cash in hand. Nora Finch had paid the filing fee. She had not paid the conversion fee. There was no record that she had ever been notified that the conversion fee was due, and there was no record that the land office had declared the entry abandoned. Silence was not abandonment. The entry was still good. She had done this work before, in the Wichita land office, for men who signed the examination and did not mention who had prepared it. This time, the document bore her own name. The federal examiner reviewed the quiet title petition in January of 1888. Pierce's argument for constructive abandonment required a showing that Nora Finch had been notified of the railroad's claim and had failed to object. There was no such notice in the record. The railroad's own patent application had been submitted without a title search that would have revealed the prior entry, which was either negligence or something more deliberate, and either way it did not change what the record showed. Harmon appeared before the examiner in Wichita on the 14th of January. Vera was not present for the hearing. She was in Aldrich's storeroom, working on a preliminary chain examination for Doss, who had sent a packet of documents south by express and wanted her opinion on a purchase in Sumner County before the end of the month. She had learned from her father that you work on the document in front of you. The hearing in Wichita was Harmon's work. The Sumner County chain was hers. The Merchants and Settlers Bank of Caldwell lost the quiet title action in February of 1888. The northeastern quarter of Section 14, Township 31 South, Range 3 West, was awarded by federal order to the estate of Nora Finch, with Elsa Finch as sole heir. The bank's attorney Pierce sent a letter to Harmon objecting to the outcome on 3 separate grounds, each of which Harmon answered in a single paragraph. Pierce did not file an appeal. The bank's exposure on the foreclosure was significant enough without further litigation, and the bank's president, a man named Garfield Tate, who operated from a walnut-paneled office in Caldwell and who had reviewed Roland Pruitt's loan papers himself in 1885, had what Vera was told was a very quiet winter. She was not told this by anyone who had witnessed it. She was told it by Aldrich, who had heard it from the man who delivered Tate's firewood. She received the information without comment and returned to the work she had in front of her. Elsa Finch did not sell the northeastern quarter. She leased it in the spring of 1888 to a family named Vogel, who had been looking for breaking ground and could not afford to buy, and the lease terms gave the Vogels 3 years to work the soil toward purchase, with a fixed price agreed in the lease itself. Elsa had no interest in farming at 53, but she had a great interest in the land her mother had walked in the spring and called hers, and she wanted someone to work it who would take care of it. The Vogels broke ground in April. Elsa came out from Emporia to watch the first furrow turned, and she stood at the fence line with her coat pulled close against the April wind and watched the iron share go into the dark earth and turn it over, clean and black and smelling of water. Vera was there because Elsa had asked her to come. She stood a little back from the fence, her satchel at her hip, her red shawl folded over her shoulders against the wind. She watched the furrow open and close behind the plow team, the dark earth falling in on itself in a long, clean line. And she thought of her father at his desk in the evenings with the lamp drawn close, running his finger along a line of recorded text and saying to her, always, "What does the document say, Vera? Not what you expect, not what they told you. What does it actually say? Have you ever found something that everyone assumed was gone, something misplaced or overlooked or simply never read? If you have, you know the particular weight of it, the way the truth sits heavier than the lie that had been standing in for it. Leave a word below if you have. The Merchants and Settlers Bank of Caldwell did not advertise the outcome of the Finch quiet title action. The case was a matter of public record, filed in federal court, and anyone who wished to find it could do so, as Vera pointed out. When Aldrich asked her whether the bank might manage to keep it quiet, she said this without particular satisfaction. The record was the record. It did not require her to announce it. What it required, in the months that followed, was that Vera find more work of the same kind. She was not a licensed attorney. The territory of Kansas in 1888 did not require a license to perform a title examination, only to argue one in court, and Harmon had done the arguing. What Vera offered was the reading, the patient, careful examination of original documents that most land buyers and their attorneys conducted in half an afternoon and called sufficient. She offered to do it the way her father had taught her, completely, going back to the original patent, checking the reverter clauses, looking for the prior entries that had been absorbed or overlooked. She charged a fee commensurate with the work, which was more than a copyist's wage and less than an attorney's retainer. And she set that fee in writing before she began, which was a practice her father had insisted on and which she had adopted as a matter of course. By the summer of 1888, she had 3 regular clients. Harmon referred her as a matter of course when a title chain was complicated. A land agent in Wellington named Doss had been burned once by a defective abstract and was not interested in being burned again. A widow named Crane in Caldwell was attempting to consolidate several small parcels left to her by her husband into a saleable section, with a deed chain running back through 6 conveyances and 3 different surnames. The Crane consolidation took Vera 4 months. She found 2 gaps in the chain, one an undischarged mortgage from 1872, and one a conveyance executed by a man who had been legally married to 2 women at the same time, which created an heir problem that required correspondence with a probate court in Ohio. She resolved both gaps before the end of the year. The undischarged mortgage had been issued by a lender in St. Louis, who had subsequently dissolved, and tracking the discharge required Vera to write to the St. Louis Circuit Court Recorder, and then, when that letter went unanswered, to the successor institution that had absorbed the dissolved lender's paper in 1879. The successor institution was a savings association in Missouri that employed a clerk who eventually, after 2 months and 3 letters, confirmed in writing that the mortgage had been paid in full and that no discharge had been recorded in Kansas, only because the original lender had already ceased operations before the discharge paperwork was filed. The Savings Association's clerk sent the confirmation on the association's letterhead. Vera had it certified and attached it to the chain. The bigamy problem was simpler in one sense and more difficult in another. The man, a farmer named Josiah Turnbull, who had sold one of the Crane parcels in 1876, had a wife in Ohio and a wife in Kansas, and neither woman had known about the other until after Josiah Turnbull died in 1882. The Ohio wife had a superior claim by date of marriage. Her heirs in Ohio were 3 children, now grown. Vera wrote to the eldest, a woman named Clara, and explained the situation without legal embellishment. And Clara Turnbull wrote back that her mother's estate had never been settled and that she had not known there was land in Kansas involved. After 3 more letters and a document from the Ohio probate court confirming the estate's standing, Clara signed a quitclaim deed releasing any interest in the Crane parcel on behalf of her mother's estate. She charged nothing for this. She said in her last letter that she was glad someone had found it and was glad to have done with it. Mrs. Crane paid her the agreed fee and then, without being asked, added $20 to the envelope. She said the extra 20 was for the Ohio letters, which Vera had written 4 times before receiving a satisfactory response. Vera put the extra 20 into her savings and wrote Mrs. Crane a receipt. She did not set up a proper office until the spring of 1889. Until then, she worked from Aldrich's storeroom, which suited her because Aldrich asked no rent, and in return she had reorganized his inventory ledger in the first week, and he had never needed to ask where anything was since. In the spring of 1889, she rented a room above the harness maker's shop on Colson's Main Street, put a plain wood sign on the door that read "Deed Examination," and bought a proper desk with 2 drawers and a lock. The desk had belonged to a land agent who had gone out of business after a fire took his inventory, and Vera paid $6 for it from the man's widow, who was selling everything in the office. It had a surface large enough to spread a full-size patent ledger page without the edges hanging off, and the lock on the right-hand drawer took a key that Vera kept on a cord around her neck beside her father's lens. These were the 2 tools she considered essential. Everything else was secondary. She bought a second wooden chair for clients and set it across the desk from her own. She bought a bottle of good black ink and 3 new pen nibs and a sheaf of lined paper. She hung no pictures and put no curtain on the window, because the light from the window was useful, and she had found, in the Wichita office, that curtains were primarily useful for making a room look occupied to passers-by, which was not a concern she shared. The sign above the door of the harness maker's shop faced the road, and the road ran south to Caldwell and north toward the Wichita stage line, and people coming into town from both directions passed it. Aldrich told her that people would not know what deed examination meant and might not stop. She told him they did not need to know what it meant. They needed to have a problem with a piece of land and not know where to take it. That was a different thing, and it proved over the years that followed to be enough. By 1892, 5 years after she first stood at that fence post in Colson, she had examined abstracts on more than 200 parcels in the counties south and west of Wichita. She had found defects in 31 of them, ranging from undischarged encumbrances to outright chain breaks, and she had referred every one of them to Harmon, or later, to a second attorney named Pryor, who had opened a practice in Wellington in 1890, and who paid a prompt referral fee and sent her clients of his own. She had testified twice as a fact witness in land court, presenting abstract examinations she had prepared, and both times the court had accepted her documents into evidence without objection. She was not famous in the way that newspaper stories made people famous. She was known in the way that reliable work makes a person known, which is quieter and more durable, and which tends to arrive at the right ears without requiring announcement. Elsa Finch's northeastern quarter produced its first good wheat crop in 1890. The 3rd year the Vogels had worked it. Elsa wrote to Vera that spring to report it, and to say that the Vogels had made their first purchase payment on schedule, which Elsa noted with approval. She said the payment had come in on time and the Vogels' children were doing well. Vera read the letter at her desk on the main street of Colson, with the April light coming in through the single window above the street, and set it in the right-hand drawer of the desk. She had kept the magnifying lens on the desk surface since the day she moved in, set in a small turned wood stand she had bought from a cabinet maker in Caldwell, who was going out of business. The lens had been her father's. Its ground edges caught the light when the morning sun came in, and threw a long ellipse of brightness across the desk surface, and in the afternoons, when clients brought documents for her to examine, she used it the way he had taught her, slowly, from the corner of the page outward, as if you were reading snow for the track of a small animal, and did not want to miss the first impression. Her father had told her once that most of what is wrong in a deed chain is not hidden. It is simply not looked for. Someone looked at what they expected to find, found it, and moved on. The error, the gap, The clause that reverts the title, it is almost always there in the document itself, written down in the same ink as everything else, waiting for the eye that will slow down enough to reach it. The lens stood on the desk in the morning light, and the ellipse it threw grew longer as the sun moved, and the street outside carried its ordinary traffic, and she had work enough in front of her to fill the day. That was enough. That was what the work required, and what the work returned. And she had learned from the man who taught her to read documents, and from the documents themselves, that a thing clearly and completely done is its own kind of record. It does not require a verdict to stand. It stands in the paper, in the ink, in the careful notation of what was there before anyone thought to look. What do you know that the people around you have never bothered to read? Leave a thought below if it stayed with you. And if you would like another story of a woman who found what had been waiting to be found, there is one waiting for you at the end of this one. The land in Section 14 still runs flat to the horizon. The short grass bends in the October wind the same way it did in 1887, without looking like it is doing anything more than resting between gusts. The wheat comes up in the spring the way wheat does when the soil has been worked with patience and without cruelty, row by row, even and certain, the way a well-examined deed chain reads from the first page to the last. The magnifying lens her father left her sat on a turned wood stand on a desk above a harness maker's shop in Colson, Kansas, throwing its ellipse of light across the morning surface for many years after that. It was doing that work when she arrived each morning and still doing it when she left. The light is not capable of missing anything. That was the lesson. The light and the patient eye that follows it.